The Loch Ness Monster is perhaps one of the world's most enduring mysteries. Does the giant reptile really lurk in a Scottish loch? Has it somehow survived for millennia on its own? Or is it something darker and more dangerous? It is, after all, a monster. Its legend dates to the 7th century, although recorded sightings really begin in earnest in the 1930s. It feels somehow ancient and modern at the same time, with scientists on a quest to find evidence either way as to its existence. While the reality of the Loch Ness Monster is beyond my scope, the legends and the ways in which people have shared their sightings are not. Much like ghost stories, Nessie sightings echo across time, with people poring over their similarities and their differences in search of the truth. So let's explore the legends of the Loch Ness Monster in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This is the final episode of 2024. I do hope that you had a very Merry Christmas or festive break, whichever, doesn't really matter. I hope you had a nice time, and here we are in the closing stretch of this year. I, for one, would be quite glad to see the back of it, but we are finishing off the underwater folklore theme with the Loch Ness Monster. And this episode has turned into something a little bit different from what I was expecting, mostly just because once I actually started looking into stuff, I realised that I was going to have to take a slightly different approach. So we won't really be looking at a lot of the scientific investigation because a lot of it is kind of not necessarily that relevant to what we're really focused on, which is the monster and its relationship to folklore. Now, if you haven't actually been to Loch Ness, I would recommend it. It is beautiful, and it is some 23 miles long, and it lies to the southwest of Inverness in the Scottish Highlands. Now, the first appearance, and I'm saying that in air quotes, of the Loch Ness Monster may date to before the Roman invasion of Britain, because scholars have found standing stones in the region that bear carvings of animals that were made by the Picts. All but one of the animals are fairly easy to recognise, with the outlier sometimes being described as a swimming elephant. There's no way to know if this is the Loch Ness Monster that the Picts knew, or if it was some other creature that they were aware of, or they just simply let somebody who wasn't very good at animals carve it, but it's certainly a fascinating carving nonetheless. And people do sometimes try to point at that to go, look, this is the first depiction of the Loch Ness Monster, but it also doesn't look like any of the other sightings that occur later, so we don't really know. Nessie next appears in a written record in the 7th century, and this is the first written record found so far. And here the monster pops up in a biography of St Columba by St Adovnan, and in the story St Columba encountered the monster in around about 563 CE while staying in the area. When he tried to cross the River Ness, he discovered some locals burying a man who had been attacked by a water monster. St Columba resolved at once to deal with the issue, and asked one of his companions to fetch the coble on the opposite bank. Once the man entered the water, the monster reappeared, apparently attracted by the disturbance in the water. The Irish saint, and I quote, with his holy hand raised on high, formed the saving sign of the cross, invoked the name of God, and commanded the fierce monster, end quote. And he ordered the monster to leave the man alone and retreat. And the monster apparently displayed fear and fled, presumably into Loch Ness. Now, it is easy to seize on this as evidence, although hagiographies often include saintly miracles that couldn't actually have occurred based on our understanding of the universe and how it works. For example, St Nicholas, who is quite a popular one at this time of year, is supposed to have resurrected 3 boys from the dead. Is it likely that that happened? Probably not, but this is the way that these saint stories often work. As Chris Kearney cautions, we can't actually take these stories literally. After all, the story is closer to allegory, providing St Columba with an opportunity to demonstrate the power of God to, up until that point, non-believing locals. Now, the idea of Kelpies and water horses end up doing the heavy lifting in the story to make St Adovnan's point, and there are people who do look at these and go, well, hang on, Kelpies and water horses exist in the folklore, so therefore were they things that the locals in the 6th century knew about, and therefore they've kind of hung this story of St Columba over the top of that. There is also a huge discrepancy between the time of the supposed event in the 560s and the time St Adovnan wrote the story down, which is basically the closing years of the 7th century. So there's such a huge amount of time that has passed between them. And obviously a lot of these hagiographies, just for what they're written for, aren't really necessarily literal descriptions of things that have happened. But it's still an interesting sighting nonetheless, and I think this is where it helps us to look at the Loch Ness Monster and its relation to folklore rather than perhaps to science. But sporadic sightings have apparently occurred until 1933, although a lot of people have actually just dismissed these earlier sightings as largely being hokum. But in 1933, the number of sightings suddenly increased, and this was no doubt due to the completion of a road alongside the loch. After all, if an area becomes more accessible, people will naturally access it. Kenny thinks we need to separate the accounts of St Columba from the 20th century sightings, since it's the idea of the Loch Ness Monster that begins in the 1930s, and there isn't really that continued legend, really, essentially, from the 7th century through to 1933. So because there isn't a direct through line, it is perhaps better to separate the two things out, particularly because there's not really a description given in the St Columba story as to what the monster actually looks like. Now, we do start getting this in the 30s. So in April 1933, an anonymous report appeared of a huge creature with multiple humps splashing in the waters. And the following month, in the Inverness Courier, Captain John MacDonald was pouring scorn on the sightings based on his 50 years' experience sailing on the loch. And apparently, even despite this, people still came forward with witness reports. And one of them described, and I quote, a monster between 20 and 30 feet long with a body like that of a huge overgrown eel, end quote. And I think that's where we start to get that very famous image of the Loch Ness Monster as basically being like a really long serpent with like the multiple humps that look a bit like car tyres in the water. And then it all changes in July 1933 because George Spicer reported a monster crossing the road in front of his car. It was, and I quote, the nearest approach to a dragon or prehistoric animal, end quote. It apparently had a big body and a high back, and it must have been from 6 to 8 feet in length. He also said it had a long neck, something that hadn't appeared in reports before, and Spicer described it carrying a small lamb or animal. He was actually writing to put a letter in the paper to ask if anybody knew what it was, so it wasn't reporting it from a sense of, I've seen a monster. It was very much, what on earth have I seen, which is a very different motivation. It all then kicked off at that point, and by October, a British circus had actually put up a reward of £20,000 for anyone who captured the animal. In December 1933, William Anstruther Gray, who was the MP for North Lanarkshire, had asked the Secretary for Scotland in the House of Commons whether anyone would investigate the monster, for science. Sir Murdoch MacDonald, the Inverness MP, told a reporter that, and I quote, nobody knows what is there, but it is quite obvious that too many people have seen something for the matter to be ignored, end quote, although he did concede that the explanation might turn out to be something entirely mundane. Big game hunter Marmaduke Wetherell, who has probably the best name ever, arrived that same month to find the monster, having been commissioned to do so by the Daily Mail. So he found footprints on the shore and took plaster casts of them, ready to send to zoologists in London. Sadly, rather than confirming they belonged to the monster, the zoologist pointed out that the prints had been made by the same object, most likely an umbrella stand made from a hippopotamus leg. Nobody really knew if Wetherell had actually created the hoax or just fallen victim to it, but either way, this dampened enthusiasm for the monster. Sightings were written off as hoaxes or as something easy to explain, like an otter, a log, or even deer swimming in the loch. One newspaper noted, and I quote, once hallucination gets a start, it soon becomes epidemic, end quote. And surprisingly, the sightings tend to be divided into two types. You've got the one who see a large creature with humps, or there's the one that mentions a long neck and flippers. And it's also worth noting that many of the witnesses were policemen, scientists, teachers, or priests. And they were often seen during the day as well. So you do then start to think, well, is this necessarily people just misseeing something, or is there actually something going on? Now, one report from January 1934 claimed that the monster had to be at least 50 years old. The witness, Mr. Brown, had stayed by the loch 50 years before, and many of those with whom he stayed reported seeing a creature in the loch. Unfortunately, Mr. Brown didn't actually describe what it looked like in the article, which does rather make it a bit of a waste of time. But the same article explained that a superintendent of the Marine Biological Station in Millport was absolutely convinced that the Loch Ness Monster was actually a great grey seal. And if you've ever seen a seal, you'll know that they don't exactly have a long neck or humps, but they do have flippers. Now, we do then start to get photographic evidence in 1934, and there's something called the surgeon's photograph, which appeared in the Daily Mail, which was taken by gynecologist Robert Kenneth Wilson. And this was the photograph that prompted speculation that the monster was actually a plesiosaur. And I was reminded when I first said I was doing this episode to tell people that plesiosaurs are not dinosaurs. They are aquatic reptiles in the order Plesiosauria, whereas dinosaurs are in the order Dinosauria. So now you know. Incidentally, in 1994, this photograph was debunked as a hoax that was made by Wetherell. He'd mounted the head and neck from a model on a toy submarine and photographed it near the shore. Now, you couldn't really make this stuff up. I mean, I know they did about the actual monster, but quite a lot of people had been looking at the image from 1934 until 1994. Some people were suspicious, other people were convinced, and again, eventually it came out that it was all nonsense. And Wetherell had decided to create the photograph as a hoax, sort of to get back at the Daily Mail for dropping him as quickly as they did after the footprints turned out not to be genuine. But of course, by that point, obviously, the photograph had really cemented the idea of the Loch Ness Monster and what it might look like in the minds of the public. Now, explorations continued throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. Further photographs have either been called into question or dismissed as photos of ordinary things like boats or diving otters. As yet, no one has uncovered any definitive proof that the Loch Ness Monster exists, at least not as we might think of the monster. So what is the Loch Ness Monster? Well, plenty of people have theorised realistic explanations for the monster. Obviously, we've got the giant eel idea, we've got diving otters and things like that. The otter one, I must admit, I'm a bit more convinced by, particularly considering the size that otters can actually grow to. But I do think it might be quite interesting to view the monster as a cryptid instead of an optical illusion or an overactive imagination. Now, perhaps the most common idea for the monster's identity is the plesiosaur, and in these theories, the plesiosaur somehow survived the mass extinction event that wiped out a lot of life on Earth millions of years ago, and then somehow continued living in the loch. If it's not the exact plesiosaur, it's somehow a descendant of those plesiosaurs that survived. Now, I'm not going to get into the obvious issues with that particular idea, but the fact that scientists have found no DNA in the loch to support the theory also rather punctures the idea. Though they have actually found plenty of eel DNA, so no one can rule out the idea of a giant eel. And obviously, if we remember, one of the very earliest sightings did describe it as looking like a giant eel. An overgrown eel could certainly be considered a monster, meaning that the Loch Ness Monster is real, it just doesn't take the form that we think it does. That said, I did see a meme online, and I really wish I could find this and I can't, but someone actually joked that the Loch Ness Monster was a ghost of a plesiosaur, and that's why it still kind of lurks in the loch but we can never find it. And I thought, oh, I like that idea. That one sort of solves a lot of the problems. But yeah, I thought that one was quite a sweet idea. But of course we can't forget the Kelpies, because I did mention them at the start of the episode. And Scotland does not lack for water spirits in its legends and lore. It really doesn't. And again, as I say, some of the articles actually referred to Kelpies or water horses, and the water horse is the Eich Uska. Now, as Catherine Briggs noted, Kelpies live in rivers and streams, while the Eich Uska lives in the sea or lochs. And our only real clue lies in the St Columba story, which, as we saw earlier, does have its own issues, and despite Kenny's caution not to take the story literally due to the political intention of the original story, this is a folklore podcast. So in terms of folklore, if we look at it from that perspective, St Columba encountered the monster in the river, suggesting a Kelpie to be the original creature. It sort of then kind of muddies the water a little bit, that it then ends up in the loch. Now, the beast tries to drag a man beneath the water, which obviously is something that we often find in Kelpie stories. And obviously Kelpies are no fan of humans at all. But of course, Kelpies are also associated with waterways all over Scotland. It would be easy to borrow an existing Kelpie story and move it to the River Ness, and then just simply add St Columba to it, because he was in Pict territory and there was a lot of intention around the story, I suppose, to show him then converting the local populace. So it would be quite easy to just take a story and move it. And we see that all the time with folklore, that stories are relocated to better suit what somebody wants to do with the story. Now, Kelpies are also pretty far away from either the long many-humped serpent-like monster or the plesiosaur options proposed by the media since the 1930s. And I do agree with Kenny that we do need to separate the original St Columba story, and to a degree even the carving of it, from the versions that we've had in the media since photography essentially came along. But of course, I would also like to play devil's advocate here, because if it was a Kelpie, then an otherworldly creature would be quite easily likely to evade a contemporary science, and I have no idea what Kelpie DNA would even look like, so how would the scientists know to look for it? So there we go. Now, obviously, I do want to point out, I am not arguing that the monster exists, and I am not arguing that it is a Kelpie. I don't know any more than anyone else does. I'm just simply putting this forward as a theory, as this is a folklore podcast. Now, it's actually, I think, if we're going to be fair, highly unlikely that Nessie exists, but I do think it would be cool if she did. I think there's something really nice about the idea. But as we're looking at folklore, not scientific evidence, that was why I wanted to explore the links to folklore, even if they get us no closer to whether or not the monster is real. I do think, though, that it is important to separate Kelpies from the media-generated view of the monster, meaning that ultimately the St. Columba story actually has nothing to do with the Loch Ness Monster at all. And of course, there is a possibility that were it not for the 1930 sightings, that the St. Columba story might have ended up just languishing in obscurity. So there's that worth bearing in mind as well. So why does the legend of the Loch Ness Monster persist? Well, I think we can point to several factors. First, the lack of evidence means that while scientists can say there is no plesiosaur DNA in the loch, they also can't identify the monster itself. The ambiguity creates a space in which people can present theories that become difficult to prove or disprove. That kind of ambiguity will always appeal to the imagination, and besides, with the regular stories of species endangerment or extinction, why wouldn't we want confirmation of a new species? The problem, of course, with this kind of ambiguity is that is the space in which conspiracy theories lie, and they are notoriously circular in their approach. You can't disprove them because you can't prove them, which means you can't disprove them, if you know what I mean. Secondly, Nessie has become a somewhat beloved figure, I would say, beneficial to tourism but also appearing in pop culture. So I'm curious if anyone listening remembers the family Ness, where there was a whole family of Nessies, and you had like her High Ness and Sporty Ness and so on. And there was two kids, Angus and Elspeth, who could summon these monsters with their thistle whistles. And it was very good. At least I remember it being very good when I was a child. So if anyone else remembers the family Ness, please do feel free to drop me a comment. But finally, the story also never really goes away. And much as we see with alien big cat sightings, and obviously there is an episode on them as well, every time a new witness comes forward, it reignites the fascination with the legend. These sightings keep us interested, discussing the possibilities, and I think it's the appeal of the unknown that keeps us going. So on one hand, it has us exploring deep space, but it also has us exploring the bottom of Loch Ness. So what I want to know is, what do you think? Do you think the Loch Ness Monster is real? What do you think it is? Or do you think it doesn't really matter? It's the story itself that's become important rather than whether or not it's true, which obviously is something that we see quite a lot with folklore. Please do feel free to let me know. Obviously on Spotify and YouTube you can leave comments. I can now reply to comments on Spotify, which is nice. Or you can obviously leave a comment on the blog post that this episode is attached to. All the links, as always, are in the show notes. Next month, I'm doing a miscellaneous month where I'm going to be having a look at the episodes where I couldn't get an entire theme out of them, but they're still worth having a look at in and of themselves. So we will be having a look at a grab bag of stuff, which would be quite a nice way to start the year, actually. And I also finally wanted to end by saying a big thank you to everyone who has supported the podcast throughout this year and obviously since it started in 2019, whether that is leaving reviews, whether that is recommending it to friends and family. You have no idea how valuable that actually is. Word of mouth is so beneficial to things like this. So for everyone who's recommended it, everyone who's named it in lists when people go, oh, can anyone recommend a folklore podcast? And this one ends up in there as well. That's always really helpful. To anyone who's bought me a coffee, or obviously my beloved Patreon supporters who are absolutely fantastic. And don't forget, you can actually now get the bonus episodes with a coffee membership as well. But for anyone who has done any of those things, whether you've financially supported the podcast or supported by simply passing it on to others, big thank you. It is basically what helps to keep the podcast going, because obviously the more people find it, the more we can sort of spread this way of looking at folklore into a wider audience. And then also the financial support is helpful for just the running costs. So yeah, there we go. Anyway, thank you very much for all of your help and support. Obviously, if you haven't left a review before and you'd like to, then you can do that as well, and that would be absolutely fantastic. And yeah, I will see you next year. That sounds really weird saying that, but I will see you next year for our next round of episodes. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.